name is Allison Kempers. I'm a preschool teacher at Wayne Township. Live in the dream. Love, most importantly, I love science. I love exploring, in geodes and mushroom hunting are my favorite pastimes. I'm a Butler graduate student, and I am just excited to be here. Thank you.
Hi, Rick Roslin, and I teach in Wayne Township, and I'm the scientist in residence. I go to 11 schools having fun with science, and I want to welcome everybody for joining us today, because as we explore fossils, dinosaurs, and crinoids, and trilobites, oh my. And I'd like to introduce my friend, Peggy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peggy Fisherkeller. I am the curator of geology at the Indiana State Museum. So that means that I am responsible for our rocks, our fossils, our minerals. And with Rick, I will be talking to you all about some Indiana fossils today.
Good deal. So fossils for me are really cool because you get to find in your hand a discovery of something from long ago. So the word fossil, I like to say the word fossil is evidence, it's a preserved evidence of past life. And you think of that preserved evidence of past life, preserved means it's like saved. You know, like we put our food in the refrigerator to freeze it to save it, or sometimes we put chemicals in it to save it, salt. So a fossil is preserved. It means it's saved. Evidence is another word for like a clue. Like I came home one day and my candy bar was missing. My drawer was open. I looked around and my daughter had chocolate on her lips. I said, "Come here, Caroline." I smelled and I could smell chocolate on her breath. And I said, "Aha, evidence, clues." She goes, "Yeah, Dad, I ate the chocolate." So a fossil is preserved evidence of past life. And life can be a plant, an animal, a virus. And so fossils give us a snapshot of one organism or individual and back in time. Now I'll let Peggy from the State Museum argue later of how old a fossil can be, because every time I ask a paleontologist, that's the person who studies fossils, paleontologist, how old does it have to be? I get a lot of different answers. So I'm going with 10,000 years or more as a fossil. So when I'm dead, you'd have to wait 10,000 years if any of my parts would be preserved. And so if I did die suddenly, I would probably not turn into a fossil. The animals and critters might eat my skin, my hair, but my hard parts, my teeth and my bones might have a chance of surviving. So when a scientist or an explorer finds a fossil, we rarely find any of the stuff that was there at the start, but sometimes we do. And so let me show you just a couple things right here. I'll keep track of my time. This right here is a picture of a way you can make a fossil. So here is, let's say this is some prehistoric mud from millions of years ago, and some seashells made an imprint in it. And that imprint squeezed down in the mud, and then maybe that shell or those animals, they got covered up, no oxygen, and nobody disturbed them, and they were covered up for a long time. And then in came some new mud, and that new mud covered them up. And when that new mud covered them up, and then we let time take it, and it takes a lot of time. So eventually it may be eroded away, and you get a cast of what used to be there. Now you can do this at home with some seashells, some clay, and some, I call it fossil mud, but actually it's plaster of Paris. So that is one way a fossil is made. Another way a fossil is made, and there's a couple things that you might want to think about when you learn about fossils, is that if we have layers called strata, or layers of rock. Let me ask you this. This is new up here, so the old must be at the bottom. And so scientists keep track of where you find a fossil, because the farther down you go in the layers, usually it's the oldest. And so how is a fossil formed? There's a fancy word, taphonomy. Taphonomy, that's a weird word, taphonomy, but here's how you spell it, taphonomy. But basically it means, here's a fish swimming in the ocean, it dies, it gets covered up, no light, nothing bothers it. It's organic, a lot of its pieces get eaten away, and it leaves an imprint, and then minerals take the place of the bones, and then we dig it, erode it out later, and we find it. much like this one I have right here. This is actually a fossilized fish from Wyoming. And you can see that it's still in the rock and it's flattened, but it does tell us a lot about the structure of this fish. And this is very old, and you can go there today and find these beautiful snapshots of this fish that lived in the ocean millions of years ago. So there's a lot of different things that you can find in other parts. And I'm going to mostly talk about things that are not in Indiana. And one of my favorite is from South Dakota, these guys right here. This is a toe bone, actually a fossilized toe bone. I always make the mistake of saying a bone. This is not the bone anymore. It's been exchanged. Minerals have come into this. This is the toe bone and the next finger, like you see right here on mine, of an animal called an Edmontosaurus. And if you look at that, see these little holes right there? Just like your fingernail, you need blood to get to it to keep it alive. And those are the holes where the blood vessels came through. And you can see how the joints went together. And that is so cool to see this. This was found. And actually, these are not from the same animal. A lot of times when paleontologists look for fossils, they might find this one from one species and this one from another. And if you look carefully, you can see how this has been glued right here. That's pretty cool. Here's a rib bone off of a Edmontosaurus. And I always say bone, and you guys can correct me. I should say fossilized bone. And the color comes a lot from the minerals, or maybe even from some of the organic material that used to be there. And if you look carefully, there's all kind of cracks on this. When we found this, this was actually, we couldn't pick it up. It would crumble apart. So once you find a fossil, and the museums know this, you take a lot of time to catalog it, to find out where it's from, and to carefully preserve it. This fossil has been laying in the ground for 67 million years. And it would be terrible if I came walking around and picked it up and then just broke it. But if you don't find it, and if it's exposed to the sun and the water and the snow, this fossil will probably disintegrate in a year or two. So it's good that we find these, we catalog them, and we preserve them. Here is a backbone of vertebrae of a Triceratops that was from South Dakota. And I got this from a rancher who, in the Badlands, and a place where there's a lot of cool fossils. In fact, you probably know about this place because one of the most famous T-Rex in the whole world was found there. The T-Rex is named Sue. And so that T-Rex was pretty amazing. And I happen to have here a cast of a T-Rex tooth. Let me show you this on a better view so you can see it just a little bit better here. This is a T-Rex tooth, and this T-Rex tooth is actually pretty big. Only this part would be sticking out of the mouth, the gums, and this is the root of the entire T-Rex. Now, this is made out of a hard plastic. Scientists make a copy of a fossil so we can study it and hold it. And it's pretty good. It's exact detail. And we find these teeth both in the jaw, or sometimes they're actually shed when a T-Rex maybe ate another animal or fought another animal. So this is a beautiful T-Rex tooth. Even though it's a replica, you can still see it was pretty amazing. I have another replica. This is one of the oldest fishes in the world. And it doesn't even look like a fish. It kind of looks like a crab. But my friends at the Black Hills Institute of Geology in South Dakota gave me this. And it's called you guys got to help me with this, a Bathiolepsis fish. And it's one of the oldest fish from the Devonian age. And the Devonian age was a time of fish. And so this is not the actual fossil, it's a cast, but I can share it, I can touch it. Whereas I would never want to touch this guy right here because it's so fragile. And so we got to, how's my time doing, Allison?
You are out of time, my friend.
Oh, well, I guess the last thing I'm going to show you, though, is my most famous fossil. And this is, let's see. Wow, look what it looks like. What is it? smell like? Let's see. Let me see if I can smell this. Remember, it's been fossilized, so it looks like that. Yeah, it smells like that. This is called a field test. I don't recommend it for everybody. Yep, it tastes like a rock, but actually it's a corpulite, which is the fossilized remains of fecal material, maybe from a prehistoric turtle, maybe a crocodile, I don't know, but it's pretty cool. So with that, and my megalodon tooth, Peggy, your turn.
All right. How do I follow that? All right. So Rick kind of talked about fossils from everywhere, but the great thing is that if you live here in Indiana, like probably most of us do, you can find fossils right here. And the fossils that we have are kind of unexpected fossils and not really what you kind of think of. And the reason is that because we had different environments and climates in Indiana than we have now. It can be a little bit hard to wrap your brain around it, but our oldest fossils in Indiana are around 450 million years old. So that's 200 million years older than the first dinosaur, way older than dinosaurs. And just for comparison, the oldest modern human fossils, they're only around 300,000 years old. So you have to put your brain into big time to start thinking about these fossils and to start thinking about how we had such different climates and environments. In the 450 million years that we see fossils in Indiana, our landscape has changed a lot, and its animals have changed a lot too. The oldest that we find are from animals that lived in the oceans. And in fact, Indiana was covered by oceans on and off for millions of years. And Indiana's bedrock formed during this time, so that's where we find most of our fossils. Our oldest fossils are from the eastern corner of the state on the way to Cincinnati, and it's called the Brookville area. So some of these lived on the ocean floor, and some lived, swimming around. And in fact, it's the best place for you and your family to go look for fossils. The road outcrops and stream beds in that area are littered with fossils from that ancient ocean, and you can find them yourself. So some of the most common ones and the fun ones to find are called brachiopods. So here's an example of a brachiopod. Brachiopods are still alive today, but they're much less common in our oceans than they were in our ancient oceans. They lived on the ocean floor. Some of them did, attached to rocks, things like that. Others lived on other animals, kind of attached, so they were a little bit higher up in the ocean, on the ocean floor. They look a bit like clams. They have two shells, but they're not at all related. Brachiopods fed by capturing food particles that enter into their shells. And here are two examples. Here's an example from the Brookville area. And here's another example from the Brookville area. This one is very different. It's flat, but it still has those two shells. This one is sort of got more depth to it, but it still has those two shells. So alternatively, here's a kind of a clam from that same area. So also this clam had two shells. It looked very much like a brachiopod, but you can see that brachiopods, you can tell the difference. Brachiopods are the same if you kind of split them down the middle. They look the same, they have symmetry, and bivalves do not have that mirror image symmetry. So that's one way that you can tell them apart. Now here, I have to be careful with this one. Here's a fan favorite. This is a beautiful trilobite. Trilobites, instead of trilobites, unlike brachiopods, actually walked around the ocean floor. They had little legs, walked around looking for tiny food particles to eat. Now this is a fantastic example. They're called trilobites, not because of their three sections here, but because of their three longitudinal sections, so trilobes, trilobites. This is a great example. Obviously, this is a beautiful big one. And you probably might not find this guy if you go hunting for fossils, but it's really common to find fragments of this kind of trilobite. Here's some smaller examples, ones that you might actually find, and these are really cool. These are called Flexicolemini, and they don't look like that one because these guys rolled up as they died. They rolled up like pill bugs. They got afraid and they died, and they were buried and became fossils. All right, let me put this guy away because it's very delicate. Okay, another cool animal that lived in the ocean at this time was this thing called a nautiloid. Now, nautiloids, this kind of animal is not alive today, but they have living relatives like octopus and squid. And in fact, nautiloid was essentially a squid with a shell. So this is a cast. This is the filled in part of the shell, and its tentacles would have been here, and they moved around by jet propulsion. And they were the main predators in the ocean because fish were barely around at this time. So these were the guys to be afraid of. They were definitely the biggest things swimming around the ocean. And this isn't even a big one. They could be up to 12 feet long at the time, which is pretty amazing. So moving forward a little bit in time, and we start seeing new types of animals. Corals were around before, but they started to become much more important in the oceans, building reefs. One place that you can see corals in Indiana in person is the Falls of the Ohio State Park, right across the river from Louisville. You cannot collect fossils here, but when the Ohio River is low, you can walk right out onto the reefs and see the corals and the other animals that lived among them. So now this is an example of a coral from that time period. With the camera, you can see kind of all the little holes on this mound, and each of those little holes is where a little coral animal lived, and they were all clones of each other. So this was sort of like an apartment building, and all the little animals lived in it. And then just imagine this one and many, 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 many more, and you start building a coral reef. So moving across the state a little bit more and a little bit more forward in time, we start finding world-class examples of a curious animal called a crinoid. So crinoids, they look like plants, but they're not. They're still alive in our oceans today, but they're less common. Most people don't ever see them. They look like plants, but they're actually animals related to things like starfish, sea urchins, so they're echinoderms. So this is the calyx here. This is the stem. And then the only thing that this one is missing is the anchoring system. Sometimes we call it a root system, but it didn't provide nutrients like plants, so it's maybe more appropriate to say that it's a root system. So these are from an area on the western side of the state called Crawfordsville. And during the Mississippian period in Crawfordsville, about 350 million years ago, Indiana was on the edge of an inland sea where a river emptied into it. And it formed a delta, much like the Mississippi River Delta today. And underwater on the delta floor, animal communities lived. And because of the nature of living on a delta, sometimes storms, something else would cause a gush of sediment to smother all of the animal communities that lived on the delta. And that was bad news for all the animals living there, but it was good news for us because when animals are smothered by sediment, guess what happens? They get fossilized. They don't get to decompose like they usually would. So we have these beautiful examples of crinoids and other animals from that area. And in fact, crinoids from Crawfordsville are so fantastic that they're in museums all around the world. You can go to museums in China and Japan and find examples of crinoids from Indiana, which is fantastic. Now this one that I'm holding up, This is a crinoid called Elegantocrinus hemisphericus, and this is Indiana's proposed state fossil. It's not our state fossil yet, but it's being proposed as our state fossil from time to time, from year to year, depending on what the legislature is doing. So this is a little beauty right here, and I've got another example to show. This is another one called Agaricocrinus, and you can tell it's got a little bit of a different calyx. It's still got the stem, and again, it doesn't have that anchoring system, but we do find some that do have the anchoring system. So in fact, so finally, oceans leave Indiana for good. We know that they did because we're nowhere near an ocean right now. So at some point, the oceans left. And that happened about 320, 30, 40 million years ago. And we start finding evidence of different kinds of animals. Instead of sea animals, ocean animals like Brachiopods and Crinoids, we start finding plants. So you can also, on the very western side of Indiana, we can find examples of leaves. Here's a leaf called Neuropterus. And here's another one, looks a little different, called Pecopterus. And these are examples of plants that helped build our coal forests. So, you know, Indiana is kind of known for coal, for all the coal layers that we have. That coal is built by vegetation. So we had really amazing forests that when plants died, they turned into coal. But the other amazing thing is that not just plants were around at this time. This is when we started having land animals walking around. So this, if you can see it, these are footprints from a reptile that was walking around a tidal flat looking for insects, living life, doing all the things that reptiles do. And we have examples of reptiles from this time. We have examples of amphibians. We don't have their bones from this time. For some reason, we haven't found their bones yet in Indiana. People have found bones from other parts of the world, but not in Indiana yet. But we do have their footprints, which is kind of cool because we can learn a lot of things about them from their footprints, like how long they were, how long their stride was, if they were running, if they were sort of interacting with each other. You can learn lots of neat things. So this is a really special fossil. So after this time, that was called the Pennsylvanian period. After the Pennsylvanian period, we really don't have any fossils for almost 300 million years. Imagine that, 300 million years. A lot went on during that time, including dinosaurs, right? Dinosaurs were almost certainly walking around here. There's no reason to think that they weren't walking around here. But Indiana and the land around it was sort of an upland. So instead of sediment depositing, sediment eroded, it went downhill. So we don't have any rocks from that time period. And if we don't have any rocks from that time period, it means we don't have any fossils from that time period either. So no dinosaurs are found here. So we have to skip forward a little bit to find more fossils. That means that we look at Ice Age deposits. So these aren't rocks anymore. This is sediment, but we find some great Ice Age fossils. And I've got a few here. And these are all about between 10 and 15,000 years old. So this goes back to what Rick was talking about with fossils. Is it a fossil? Is it not a fossil? Most of these are over 10,000 years old, so we would technically call them fossil. But here's the cool and tricky thing. A lot of these bones aren't fossilized. The minerals haven't changed their structure. So they're just like my teeth or my bones, but they're maybe discolored a little bit. But they're over 10,000 years old. So as a paleontologist, we would still call them fossils, right? Here are two examples of things. This is a mastodon tooth, and that's a single tooth. So mastodons, I don't know if everyone knows what mammoths and mastodons are. They're both hairy Ice Age elephants. Mastodons were shorter, their bones were shorter, they're a little bit stockier, their bones were sort of bigger. Mammoths were taller and their bones were a little narrower, they were more gracile. So we like to say that mastodons were the football players and mammoths were the basketball players. But there were some major differences between them. In fact, they weren't even closely related, because here's a mastodon tooth, and now here I've got a mammoth tooth. See, they look super different. And this one has a very small eating surface, but this actually looks more like a modern elephant, and they're more closely related to modern elephants than they are to mastodons. So that means they ate different things, right? They both lived here in Indiana. They probably crossed paths. We find remains of them from all over Indiana, from every county, but they both looked their teeth especially look different. So mammoths with this surface, this kind of chew surface, probably ate more grasses, things like that. Imagine a cow chewing cud. And mastodon.
And Miss Peggy,
yeah,
we're about out of time if you want to finish up what you were saying about the two. And we have quite a few questions in the chat box. So for Mr. Crosland and for you too. So if you want to wrap that up, and I can get to those questions.
Sure. Yep. The last thing I was going to say was mastodons with this chew surface probably ate more twiggy, woody material. And then I will throw it over to you.
Great. Chris had some wonderful questions. He wanted to know more about an Edmontosaurus, and he wanted to know about that dinosaur. And he also wanted to know if it was a herbivore, a carnivore, or omnivore.
Sure. Thanks for that question. So the Edmontosaurus, we nicknamed that as the cow of the Cretaceous, because it seems that's what T-Rex ate. It was a duck-billed dinosaur, and I have teeth I found, and the teeth almost look like that mammoth tooth, because there are a whole bunch of teeth, small in order for chewing, not for breaking bones and not for grabbing flesh. So we would say it was an herbivore. It's called an Edmontosaurus. Most fossils are named three ways: who found them, where they're found, or what they look like or how they act, like a T-Rex, a Tyrannosaurus, tyrant, lizard, king. And Edmontosaurus, the first one found and described by scientists, was found outside of Edmonton, Canada. So it got the name Edmontosaurus. And I will say that I love, Peggy, what you did at the State Museum. You guys should go to the State Museum. You can see a lot of these fossils. And this one right here is woolly mammoth hair. So sometimes a fossil can be actually what's left of that. Now, we don't have a mosquito to get DNA or bring a dinosaur back to life yet, but that is so cool. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Yes, and also another question too is about the horseshoe crab was alive when the dinosaurs were. They wanted to know if that was, the crab was alive then. That's
a Peggy question, right?
Oh, the trilobite?
So I think that's what he was referring to.
Okay, yeah, yes.
It looked like one. Maybe it looked like a horseshoe crab, perhaps.
Yeah, I think they were. I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one. It's a little bit early in the morning and I can't think of when they went extinct. So I think they overlapped though a little bit, yes.
A lot of animals that are living today, even though we call it a living fossil, may not be the exact species, but very closely related. Like we have plants called horsetail rushes that you can find in marsh, and you might even find a plant that looks very much like that. And the scientists, I don't know if they're the exact species, but very closely related. I have to show you though, my favorite fossil, one of my favorite fossils in the whole world, I found in Indiana, and it's very beautiful. I found it like that, and it was from the mud of what Peggy was talking about. And when I took a hammer and gently cracked it open, that's what I found. And that is a, what's that one, Peggy? Optilus? What's the name of this?
Picopterus.
Pecopterus, a fern leaf fossils. We have time for maybe one more question.
Okay, the last question comes from Banks, who's 5. He wonders, how do you find these fossils? How do you get started?
So a great way to start finding these fossils, I mean, you can go look in your yard. You might not find them, but if you start going to look at where there's rocks, where there's outcrops, and you might need your parents to help take you there, go down to the Brookville area and park safely along the side of the road. And just kind of find areas where rocks are outcropping along the road, and you're going to start finding fossils.
Yep, Banks, and the good thing about you, Banks, if you're 5, you're closer to the ground. So your eyes are closer to the fossils. You can find them. Look in your driveway, because most of the rocks in Indiana are sedimentary rocks, and you might find fossils. Or the next time you go downtown to a building, if it's white limestone, get up close to that. You might see little bitty fossils. You know, they're fun and easy to see. And also, parents and everybody, in the chat feature, we put I run a summer camp. We take kids to fossil collecting, and there's a link on how you can go and the safe way to collect fossils, a family field trip. Guys, thank you. And Peggy, thank you from the Indiana State Museum. That was awesome. I love your job. And Allison from Butler and Wayne Township, thank you for helping. And guys, this will be recorded, and leave a message in the chat. We'll see you next time.